Okay, world history students, today we're going to have a brief examination of what we call Imperial China. This is going to be China after the Mongols. The Mongols were that civilization that took over most of Asia in the 1200s CE, but they have a relatively short life. While they take over a vast amount of territory, they don't really hold it that long. So what we want to pose here is what happens in China in the centuries after the Mongols, in the 13, 14, 15, 16, 1700s. And that's what we're calling Imperial China. And the real purpose of this is to show you that China had a sort of peak of their civilization prior to the European arrival of prosperity, conquest, unity, and remarkable technological achievements that we want to make sure that we emphasize prior to talking about the European arrival and the changes that inflicts upon Asia. So, China after the Mongols, we want to focus on two particular dynasties during this time period. The Mongols kind of collapse by the end of the 1200s, early 1300s CE. Much of their rule over most of East Asia and beyond is going to crumble, and China goes into a period of disunity. China gets reunified under a new dynasty, a new ruling political government called the Ming Dynasty. And they really have their heyday from about the 1300s to the 1600s. This is going to be the period of Ming China. What are some highlights of this period? Because in many cases, you could point to the Ming Dynasty as one of China's real high points as a civilization over the centuries. Well, the Ming are very effective at expanding trade routes and developing new products. While silks and porcelain had always been a thing in China, it's going to be during the Ming period that silks and porcelain, as well as other products that can't be accessed throughout other parts of the world, that those are going to get traded with parts of South Asia and eventually make their way to Europe. And these new products are going to entice Europeans especially to want to get to China. It's during the Ming period that Europeans are sending out their first voyages of exploration. This is during the time of Christopher Columbus. This is during the time of the early settlement of the New World in the Caribbean and the conquistadors and New Spain. All of that is concurrent with the Ming period. And again, it's this wealth of the Ming that Europeans are trying to get to. It's a period of general prosperity. Much of China during the peak years of the Ming is going to be relatively peaceful. There are uprisings. There's, of course, conquest. There's, of course, an attempt to unify much of East Asia, but it's going to be relative peace and prosperity for a good chunk of that. It's also during the Ming period that much of the Great Wall of China that we think of, that you'll see in a Google search when you Google Great Wall of China, most of that is going to be built during the Ming period. I want to show you one achievement here of the Ming Dynasty. I mentioned that it was a period of technological achievement and prosperity and wealth. One of the biggest examples of that is going to be the voyages of Zheng He, who's going to be a Chinese explorer who has his own fleet that's going to travel not only into the Pacific, but in throughout the Indian Ocean, as far away as the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Horn of Africa. Zheng He is going to make his way to much of the Middle East, and the Ming Dynasty is going to embark on some crazy, ambitious ship construction. And just to show you how ambitious and how grand that is in comparison to other civilizations, look at this image here. The image on the far right, the ship that jumps out at you, the Ming treasure ship, that's one of the ships that's going to be used during this time period. This is going to be constructed in the early 1400s, almost 100 years before Columbus, about 70, 80 years before Columbus's first voyages. This is it in comparison to the Santa Maria, for instance. The ship directly to its left, the tiny ship to its left, the Santa Maria is what Columbus sails into the Caribbean with in the late 1400s. That's how it would compare, and you see it compared to some of the other European ships. When you watch the Edpuzzle for this video, it will talk a little bit about that, and it will show you the scope and grandeur of what the Ming were able to achieve and build. The Ming also, as I mentioned, construct most of the Great Wall that we think of today. While walls had been constructed to separate most of mainland China from northern Mongolia, it is largely constructed during this period of the 14, 15, 1600s. The area that you see in orange here, that's going to be the parts of the Great Wall that are constructed during the time of the Ming, and it's going to get linked up with other spots, and armies and garrisons are going to be stationed there. But this is another example of the wealth and power of the Ming, that it's during this time period that they make this lasting physical achievement. The Ming don't last forever. They rule until about the mid 1600s, right around the time that the Mughals are beginning to dominate India. The Ming are going into their decline. A new dynasty, as so frequently it happens in Chinese history, emerges out of the chaos. This is called the Qing dynasty. They have their run from about the 16 to 1900s, and they kind of have the distinction of being the last of the Chinese dynasties before the 20th century. It's the dynasty that collides with the Europeans in a big way and is going to be rife with a lot of internal problems, especially towards the end of its reign in the 18 and 1900s. It does reunify China and it manages to impose order. But as I said, the Qing dynasty is going to be the political government that faces the Europeans. And when the Europeans first arrive, it's very important to realize they are very limited. They can't just wander into China and start trading. The Qing dynasty is extremely powerful, and compared to the Europeans at the time, who are very not powerful. And to demonstrate this lack of power, the Qing isolate the first arrivals, the British and the Dutch East India companies, but also the French and the Portuguese and other groups that arrive, to a handful of port cities. And they can't really go into the interior of China and do the type of trade that they want. And there's not a whole lot the Europeans can do about it because the Qing are powerful, the British, the Dutch, and the other European groups are not at this point. One of the reasons for this, you might ask, well, why are the Qing unwilling to trade with the Europeans? Probably the biggest reason is because the Qing are not interested in trade because they're entirely self-sufficient. The Chinese economy and civilization makes all of the best things already. They make the exotic products like porcelain and silk and a variety of others. They have their own agricultural system. They have a variety of technological developments. This is all before the Industrial Revolution, but they are willing to take European silver and gold coins. So from a European perspective, the Chinese trade is not all they're hoping to get out of it. In many cases, European companies are going to find that they're going to be losing money, and they're going to be constantly searching, the Europeans that is, for new products that the Chinese want. And finding this desire of the Chinese is going to be something that really the Europeans struggle with. By the mid 1800s, even before that, you could argue that the Qing dynasty is very rife with corruption. There are internal rebellions. There's a couple of really bloody rebellions that we'll talk about in the next lesson. But by the mid 1800s, they're well into their decline, and the Europeans are on a sort of ascendancy. So what I'd like you to do now that this screencast is over, I'd like you to watch that short 3.5-minute Edpuzzle that's linked in today's plan.